What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Tagliere, coming at you with an episode of epic proportions. While I've been a season-long guy for quite a long time, I started to get heavily into the NFL draft about 2 years ago. Once you start to dive into the who's who of NFL draft analysis, you can't get very far without finding the guy that we have on our show today. Every time I listen to him talk about a player, I learn something and have a direct takeaway as to something that I need to look closer at. That's why we brought him in, for you guys, our listeners, to learn something valuable today. His name is Matt Waldman, and you can find his work at Football Guys, as well as mattwaldmanrsp.com. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Mike, it's a pleasure. I'm glad that we have a chance to meet up and talk shop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a long time. I think we've both been in this industry for quite a while, but this is our first time actually recording a podcast. And I'm going to sit back and I'm going to take a lot of the information from Matt because there's a few guys in the industry that I really, really respect. And, if you go and look at some of Matt's work on his website, you're able to see the depth he goes into. And even, he does some YouTube videos as well, where he goes into and covers why he feels the way he does. And that's what this is all about, right? Going through the process over the result, because sometimes people will look at the result and think that a player is good, but there might be some warning signs. We're definitely going to talk about all that stuff. Just last week, we covered the running back position and the names that you should pay attention to on draft day. So naturally, we're going to head over to the wide receiver position today. It is obviously a position that has more names that we need to pay attention to. So we're going to attempt to hit on about 15 of them today, giving you an idea as to the type of player that they should be in the NFL, though obviously a lot of that stuff's going to dictate where they go, what offense they land in, but we'll give you an idea as to the player that we're talking about. So before we get into the wide receivers, I do want to remind you guys about the giveaway that we're doing thanks to our sponsor, sportsintegrity.com. They're a company that has been in the sports memorabilia business for 17 years now, providing certified authentic signatures. And not just sports either. They have these out-of-world collectibles. Like there's a 1969 authentic, unused Woodstock ticket for sale on there right now. They also have a boxing glove signed by Paulie from Rocky. I mean, I might talk my wife into getting me for that. I don't know, for some present coming up. They obviously have helmets, footballs, whatever your choice. Make sure to go check them out at sportsintegrity.com. We have one of those signed helmets, if you guys missed it last episode, which happens to be one of the best fantasy players out there, Le'Veon Bell. That's right. We are giving away a full-size signed Le'Veon Bell helmet for free to one of our podcast subscribers. All you have to do is head over to fantasypros.com/contest to submit your entry. So go on and do that now. Without wasting any more time, let's talk about some wide receivers. And Matt, I'm not going to be shy about this. I hope you don't disagree with me about who I'm going to have as the number one receiver in this class, because I'm dead set on this. I don't know if anybody can change my mind, and that's Alabama's Calvin Ridley. Matt, what's your take on Ridley before I go on gushing about him?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that Ridley's a guy that even if you don't say he's the top guy, he's certainly one of the top guys on this list. And one of the things that really separates him from anybody else in this class is his explosiveness. His short area quickness is probably one of the most important traits that you're looking for from an offensive skill player who handles the ball other than the quarterback. And really, we talk about deep speed a lot, but it's really about the ability to get separation within the first 5 to 15 yards. It's something that Bill Walsh talked about a lot early on in his career when he was really establishing the West Coast offense. And that's why he drafted a guy like Jerry Rice, who wasn't particularly fast with long speed, but had very good suddenness. And Ridley has both good long speed and he has suddenness. So it helps him get off the line of scrimmage. It allows him to work deep as well as shorter patterns, but also he's fantastic at yards after the catch when he's in open space. He's one of the few guys in this class where you could see him work across the middle, catch a pass, have a trailing defender over top of him, maybe 2 steps behind him, but over top. And he's one of those few guys that can actually plant his feet and to come to a quick stop and cut back behind that trailing defender and not have that defender even touch him. I mean, so you're looking at someone with that kind of explosion. I know a lot of people, think of someone like that and say, oh, well, Antonio Brown is that kind of player. Where Ridley to me has, maybe some issues that don't make him an Antonio Brown type of player is that he's not great at the catch point when he's dealing with contact that he can see or when his back is to the football. He's better at it when he's running timing routes where maybe his back's to the defender and he's facing the ball and he takes a hit to the back. He's all right catching passes like that. Julio Jones was pretty good at that. And Julio Jones had the same kind of issue, actually, which was that when he had to face down defenders and catch the ball and see the contact coming, he dropped more passes than he caught. Whereas a guy like AJ Green basically could have an Eric Berry, Eric Berry could be half of the sandwich coming at him and he'd still hold on to the football. So, it doesn't mean that you look at those two players and they've both been great wide receivers in the NFL. You're going to have some flaws. To me, if there's a player that he could aspire to, and he's going to need a great quarterback to aspire to this, but Marvin Harrison is a player that Calvin Ridley reminds me of in terms of, dimensions, in terms of speed, ability to, smoothly win the ball and get open, off of the fact that he has, strong skills to separate. He has one of the best, what you call rocker steps in the college game, which is the ability to, maybe take a step, in one direction, plant hard and work back to the inside or outside. Amari Cooper, another Alabama alum, who he played with, has a terrific rocker step, and Ridley follows suit in that regard. So I think that he has a chance at worst to be a strong complementary receiver in an NFL offense as a deep threat and screen game threat who can also, occasionally work over the middle for you on slants and crossing routes. But at best, he could be paired with a play action quarterback who, worked in an offense where they run a lot of different looks where he can get, it's not so much about him getting plastered, on coverage and winning those types of balls, but more where he can get separation off of timing and be able to make the catch with his back to the defender and running away from them.
I love the explanation there, saying at worst he's a number 2 in an offense where he's a complementary piece. And I say that because there's a lot of people talking about the draft right now and where Ridley's going to go. And, mocks, including my own, have him going to the Chicago Bears at number 8, which kind of makes a lot of sense, knowing all the holes that the Bears have at the wide receiver position. And Ridley, that's the thing, is there's a lot of people talking about Kevin White and the Bears don't want to draft another receiver because they're worried about that bust potential at a wide receiver. And, someone posted a chart on Twitter the other day going over the last 3 years talking about the busts that have happened at wide receiver. I think Calvin Ridley is like bust proof. And I don't use that term very often, but I think he comes with a severely high floor where it's like everything that he does well. It translates to the NFL. Route running never leaves you. Jerry Rice, the reason he played to 40 was because the route running never left him. You know what I mean? The speed translates at every single level. Ridley gets separation. And I think the biggest knock on him is the production at the college level. But if you go back and Matt, I'm not sure how you do it, but I take very little stock in terms of, a college stats because it varies so much from level of competition. It varies so much from the style of offense that they're running. And when you have Hurts throwing you the ball, Jalen Hurts, who he had as his quarterback, throwing the ball 18 times per game in a run heavy offense in a team that relied on just stopping you with straight up defense, Calvin Ridley, his stats were never going to be there like that. If you go back to his time with Jake Coker before Hurts took over as the quarterback, Coker says that he's unguardable. Amari Cooper said that when he came into school, Ridley was better than he was. And that's the thing, is some people see regression, but there really wasn't. It had to do with more circumstantial things. He's a matchup nightmare. You mentioned it. He could beat you over the top, and if you give him too much of a cushion, he's going to plant his foot in the ground, he's going to turn around, and he's going to have, 5 yards of separation, making an easy target for a quarterback. The press coverage, is that a concern because he's 6'1", I think he's 185. I think the 190 that we've heard, I think that's a little big. I think he's in the 180 somewhere.
Right. That's
a real thing. But remember, Antonio Brown, again, you mentioned Antonio Brown. I'm not saying that he's going to live up to that comp, but he has some traits in his game that allow him to get open. If you press him, he will beat you over the top because he's got that juke step off the line where he could take a few steps back and create that separation with his footwork. So again, if you're out there listening and you're worried about Calvin Ridley or your team taking him in the first round, I wouldn't be worried just because of the fact that the stuff that he does extremely well will translate to the NFL game.
And I think that the points you raise are very good ones that I'd like to add to, because when you talk about let's first talk about separation. Yeah, he can get hung up on, against a physical cornerback who's patient with him, and he can get pressed and have difficulty being able to get separation at times. But at the same time, that happens to a lot of players against physical cornerbacks. It's going to happen in every game with every good wide receiver against any good NFL press corner. But the whole point about him being smaller and not being able to handle press coverage, see, to me, that's kind of a thing that people get hung up on, and they shouldn't, because it's about precision, footwork, and handwork, and understanding where your leverage points are and being able to time that well. You don't have to be, if you were, it's kind of like wrestling, size is going to matter at certain points. If you were facing off in a 150 pound, if you're a 150 pounder in a weight class in wrestling and trying to use leverage and speed to beat a 200 pound man, you're probably going to lose because the power differential is that great. Mm-hmm. But it's not that way with wide receivers against cornerbacks. So the differential is small enough that really it's about that precision, that leverage, and understanding how to beat that man with more strategic and technical means. And so in contrast, a guy that we'll talk about later is Simi Cobbs, who is, is listed at 6'4", 220, and he gets, basically they ride him up the sideline and pin him out of bounds on a regular basis against press coverage because he does not know what to do other than use a chop move or push off. And he gets eaten alive in press coverage on a regular basis compared to a guy like Calvin Ridley. And Isaac Bruce didn't have a problem against press coverage. Marvin Harrison only played on one side of the field for the Indianapolis Colts, and they knew where, as Deion Sanders, I once heard him say, everyone knew where he was. Everyone knew where to put their press cover corner. And Marvin Harrison had 10 1,000 yard seasons in a row with double digit touchdowns. It's one of those things that the size thing can get overblown. And the same thing with statistical analysis in terms of the stat production, because while it's a nice indicator to say, these are receivers who should be on your list to evaluate because they're producing at a high rate at the college game, then the next question should be, well, how good are they? Not the stats saying this is how good they are because of their stats. No, this is that they should be on the list for you to consider because they are producing well. Well, how are they doing it? And then you look into the context of that. And so when you look at a guy like Calvin Ridley and you understand that maybe he doesn't have great stats, the thing that you should be studying really are behaviors and stats that are at least predictive of certain types of on-field behaviors, not predictive of results, in my opinion. Some things may do that, and there may be some things that have real merit statistically in that level. But by and large, I'm looking at stats that are predictive of behaviors on the field. Certain metrics, workout metrics that may coincide with a player's style of movement, how that movement's used strategically at that position, or as a subset of how that position is used in an offense. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, he may not have great stats, but I even look at running backs this way and often have high grades on running backs who averaged, less than 3 yards per carry in games where, most people were saying, well, the offense was so overwhelmed by the defense that, that's why he wasn't doing well, when I've had them graded extremely high because of the behaviors and movement and all the things that you should look for individually outside of that, compared to players who maybe other people were saying he's the next great back in the NFL. Darren McFadden is a good example. Next great back in the NFL. Look at his production. Look at what he's doing. He's so fast. He's so strong. And I'm thinking, when you watch him, he's only strong when he's running about 10 yards unfettered down the field in the straight line, building up speed and able to lower his pads into someone. And even then, sometimes he gets knocked backwards by a safety after he's done that. What kind of strength is that? That's not strength. That's not leverage. coverage. Those are things, and I've graded players, on the, conversely, who have had great statistical outputs and had given them extremely low grades, like Bishop Sankey and Andre Williams and Darren McFadden, who saw them as fit-based talents in certain types of blocking schemes until they learned better. Whereas, Ahmad Bradshaw, Matt Forte. Matt Forte I watched once against LSU, and LSU had every single player on LSU except for one could outbench the entire offensive line of Tulane. And he averaged less than 3 yards per carry in that game, and he had one of the highest grades I'd given a running back in years. And so the statistical end is important, but it's just having that placement for it. And when you look at Ridley, he's not getting ton of stats, but your point about him as a freshman with Coker, I've gone back and watched that tape, and certainly, the same things you see there are the same things you're seeing now. It's just that he's getting more opportunities to do it back then.
Yep. And you'll see him on the field. You'll see him on the field with, 5-10 yards of separation where he doesn't even get a look because it's a one read offense and then they take off running the ball. So there's a lot of things with Ridley we could talk about. I do now talking about the numbers and the things that people fall in love with. This next player I want to talk about is one that's very controversial. I'm talking about Southern Methodist Courtland Sutton. He's a bigger wide receiver. He's 6'4", he's 220. He's everything you want in your prototypical number one receiver. We go back a couple years and people are just looking for the next AJ Green, Julio Jones. Kevin White was a guy that people thought was going to develop into that. This is where opinion kind of comes into play because some have Sutton as their number one receiver while others have him outside of their top five. There are some falling in love with that size, and while I get that, his hands aren't what I would call great. He's such a long strider, it's hard for him to be a phenomenal route runner just because there's not enough steps in between there for him to make those sharp breaks. That doesn't mean he doesn't move well for a guy who's 6'4", but it's hard for him to create the separation that guys like, some of the smaller receivers do. Matt, how do you see Sutton's game translating, and do you think that he comes with higher bust potential than some want to admit?
Oh, he definitely comes with higher bust potential than some want to admit, but he's a player that, I remember when I first watched him, I thought, okay, so this is the guy everyone's talking about, huh? Okay. I'm not very impressed with what I saw. And it was because the first thing you want to see from a wide receiver is, can he catch the football? And certainly he makes some really nice catches. He can catch, hands technique. The best way to describe it is try and create a diamond image or a triangular image with your hands when you're going up for a ball and you have your index fingers pointed together. You've got your thumbs together and it looks like you're kind of making a pyramid shape with your hand, to face the ball. And the reason that they do that and the way that you want to have that technique going upward, or on the other hand, having your pinkies together and your palms up when you're having a pass arriving at your belt line and below, is that you're allowing your hands to be in position so that when the ball strikes them, that your fingertips are able to touch the ball and slow down the spin. You don't want that spinning ball hitting your palms because it's hitting a broad surface all at once, and it's going to create a harder recoil off of your hands. If you have these, 6 to 10 little shock absorbers being able to grip it with their individual strength, the wonders of your body's engineering allows it to actually customize the grip force at that speed to be able to slow the spin of the ball and make it a complete stop. And it also creates second chance opportunities. If the ball does bounce off your fingertips, it softens the bounce. The recoil isn't as hard, so you get a second chance to catch it, and you can also attack the ball earlier. So when you look at a guy like Courtland Sutton, what you end up seeing is a guy who doesn't always know how to use his hands. Sometimes he'll use the correct diamond grip going upwards. Sometimes he'll use the good underhand technique when the ball's at the belt line and below. But more often than not, you'll see him trying to clap his hands on the ball. Think of like a 3-year-old learning how to catch, and you throw the ball and he claps, and it's like this big giant clap, and either his hands end up embracing himself and the ball hits him in the forehead and he starts crying, or it's a smaller clap and the ball kind of bounces off the front side of his palm or of his hand where the knife edge is and flies offward. Courtland Sutton isn't that dramatic in missing the ball like that because he has good hand-eye coordination for the most part, and he's often doing this in difficult situations. But he oftentimes tries to clap his hands on the ball, and the ball flies through his fingertips when he's clapping it on like that because his hands aren't forward, making that webbing where he's catching the point. He's trying to catch the sides of a fast spinning object. And so that ends up, he ends up going through his hands, bouncing off his chest, or he can't get both hands on the ball because he's not getting his hands in the proper position. And it happens on plays that separate a good contributor in the NFL from your top tier primary weapon who you're going to call on third down to be that guy. Now, and when I look at him, that's probably the greatest issue is that I have him in my top 10. And I don't usually talk about my rankings until I put out the RSP, but he's probably going to be in my top 10. He's close to being in my top 5, but there's some guys that have smaller differences that I think there's a little bit more upside for them because of that catching issue. Now, at the same time, I think he's pretty smooth for his size. He's physical enough that he can win. He can be inconsistent with some of the skills that he shows where people are going to say, look at what he did here. That's wonderful. And you're going to have other people say, look at the lack of effort here or him not knowing what to do on this play. And they'll argue to death. But the point is that you have a physical player who's quick for his size, who can get up to full speed pretty well for what his speed is, and combine that with his physicality. And you have a guy who, if if everything works out and he works hard and he can correct this hands issue, a guy like Quincy Enunwa corrected this issue and Enunwa had even worse hands position issues. I mean, I've seen him do things that look like, fraternity, hand signal signs, that you would look at and go, how do you catch a ball like that? Or are you trying to do a trick play? What are you trying to do? Is there do you get extra points for, trick catches that no one should ever try on a football field? Because that's what a noon one would do. But he worked hard on it and became a pretty competent contributor who, if not for injury, might have developed into a starter last year. And I think that Sutton, if he aspires and learns that, he's got more of an upside like a Brandon Marshall might have. Even if he adds a little bit more weight, he can be kind of a physical player in that realm. But if he doesn't, and catching the ball continues to be this kind of, riddle or poetry he doesn't understand, or a math problem that he doesn't understand the formula to, he could wind up being more like a Robert Meacham, the former Saints receiver who had that size, the speed. But I watched him at Tennessee, and every time he caught the ball with his hands, it looked like he was trying to figure out calculus. And he'd drop enough passes in some of those games that as a senior early on that he just revert back to trapping the ball because he was like, we've got to win the game. And the only way I'm able to they targeted me like 5 times and I dropped 3 of these passes using the technique I'm trying to learn. I have to revert back to what works. And it doesn't work that well in the NFL.
For sure. And that's the thing is like adding that in there, it could make the difference between him getting a starting job and him actually waiting on the bench and then turning into one of those players that people talk about a year or two from now and saying that he was a bust. So that's the difference. And I love how you mentioned the hands, because I think that looking through his college production, obviously the opportunity was there with him as the number 1 receiver, a little bit more pass happy than Alabama. The level of competition wasn't the same as Calvin Ridley had. So you should expect to see some ups in his production. He was a bit up and down. There was 600-yard games in there, but there was also 5 games of less than 50 yards. So that might come down to those inconsistent hands you were talking about. So, as is the case with a lot of these prospects, a lot of it, we mentioned on the running back show, where it's going to come down to where they go. Some players never ever get a chance to shine because of where they went. And maybe they didn't fit the style that the team thought that they were going to. They go to a new situation, they perform. Robert Woods is an excellent example. In Buffalo, he was buried on that depth chart. He was considered one of the least efficient wide receivers in football. He went over to the Rams. He did well. Like John Ross last year. Matt, I'm not sure where you were at on John Ross last year, but he's a player that I really did like. I felt like there was more to his game than just speed. And I still feel like he's a player that if you're in a dynasty league right now that you should be buying. I got him for a late 2nd round pick a couple weeks ago. So I'm still buying him. I feel like there's a chance, but I feel like he fell in a team that I don't know. I don't think that the Bengals really knew what they were doing. I don't think they know what they have in John Ross. And, instead just keep shipping Brandon LaFell out there, keep putting Tyler Boyd out there and do your thing. But I don't want to go on a tangent too much about the Bengals because that can go on for a long time. But I mean, I'm hoping that we're on the same page here too, because there's someone that I like more than Sutton, and a lot of people have him lower than him, and that's Oklahoma State's James Washington. When I first saw Washington on tape, he looks like a running back, and like it kind of gave me the wrong feel. Like just the initial impression was just like, he looks like a running back. We've seen this receiver before, but when you watch him, he's a wide receiver through and through. I mean, he's got the strength to beat press coverage because he's obviously big enough. He's thick enough. The speed to beat the defense over the top, which was something I really didn't expect him to have. But he got separation at the top level, and he has elite ball tracking skills. Like he can watch the ball over his shoulder. He adjusts extremely well. He can make a catch in traffic. I'm having trouble. I mean, I don't know if Washington, I want to say that I don't think he has elite speed, but I think he has really good game speed. And I don't know if it has to do with his routes, but is there anything that concerns you with Washington, or are you on a different route than me saying that Washington isn't as good as maybe I think?
I love James Washington. And if there were a receiver that I might rank ahead of Calvin Ridley, it might be him. And I know a lot of people might say, well, that might be insane, and it might end up being insane if he runs, a 4.65 40 and his initial, burst off the line of scrimmage is average at best. Then you might look at that and say, well, maybe the matchups and some of the things that they do with him don't, translate well on the field in the college game against college corners that may be more questionable against NFL corners. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to see James Washington probably run under 4.6. I think he'll probably run under 4. I wouldn't be surprised if he runs in a, high 4.4s to mid 4.5s. That's what, now to me, the opportunity to guess 40 time is kind of like guessing weight at a fair, so yeah, it's not exactly don't take what I said with a grain of salt, but one of the things that he's great at is stacking the defender. And this is probably one of the more advanced concepts that you see from a wide receiver in the vertical game, is when they can get early separation and they can cut off the defender's path and they are running ahead with their back. Once you do that, it does not matter how fast you are in the final 20 to 30 yards of a route, because that defender is going to have to run through you to make a play. And then you're just drawing, defensive pass interference penalties left and right. So not only that, but you can also control the pace, because if you're a good ball tracker over your shoulder, which Washington, like you mentioned, really is. I mean, I was showing last night on Twitter, a few plays where he's actually catching the ball. And he does this often where he leans back and looks over his back shoulder and puts his hands just above his shoulder pad and catches the ball with his hands, and there's like no recoil of his hands to touch his pads. And imagine, I just want you to, go out with one of your buddies listening to this, if you're listening to this podcast, and, someone who can throw a ball at least 25 yards. And go run 25 yards downfield and have that guy try and hit you and try and catch a ball to your back shoulder like that. And I bet out of 10 times you do it maybe 3 to 4, if you're really good at it, and hadn't played at a high level, because that's a very difficult catch. And so when you look at that type of thing, and then you see, the movement after the catch, the way that he exhibits details in terms of being able to spin, stiff arm, make the first man miss, get yards after contact. He doesn't necessarily look like a running back when he's after the catch, even though the 28 makes him look like one, as well as the 6'1", 205 frame. But, he's good after the catch on that level. And the thing that some people probably didn't think about as much, I go to the Senior Bowl every year, and, a lot of people go to the Senior Bowl, play up why it's important to go to the Senior Bowl. I'm not necessarily one of those people on a regular basis. I mean, I find a lot of worthwhile reasons to go. Sometimes it isn't even based on what's happening on the field. But in one of these cases where I thought it was really worthwhile to watch a player this year was James Washington, because he was by far the best at separating and running routes against tight man coverage all over the field, day after day after day. His use of his hands, his ability to manipulate he has more release moves than any receiver in this class. My favorite receiver at doing that last year was Cooper Kupp, who basically dominated there, and also on film when he had opportunities to use different moves. But Washington, he's got a rip move, which is that kind of working upward. He's got a chop. He can use a hook when a defender kind of ties him up at the sideline to be able to basically reverse positions and get back inside. He has the normal chop arm over move. He can stack. He's got 3-step, 4-step release moves. He's got a rocker step, and he can actually combine a 3-step and a rocker step in succession to set up a defender. So he's got a library of moves that he uses well, but you don't always see that at Oklahoma State because the role they're using him is basically slants, throwouts, and post routes, and occasionally a fade. And he's usually not having to rely on that much type of information in order to, those types of things to be able to succeed. So he showed a lot more in the Senior Bowl. And if his speed is anywhere, if his speed is in the 4.4s, then he will likely be my top receiver in this class because it will match what I saw on tape and what I think I'm seeing there. And if it's not, if it's higher, then he may drop a little bit. But I see a competent wide receiver in the NFL who could wind up being better than people think.
Absolutely. And I think, and that's something I wanted to mention about Calvin Ridley, I totally forgot about, is that you're going to hear a negative on his age. People are going to say that he's going to be 24 at the end of this year and that he's an older wide receiver to be drafted. And while that is the case, my argument to that was if you get an elite talent, 24 is nothing. 23 is nothing. If Antonio Brown were to go back into the draft at 27 years old, you're drafting him in the top 10. Like, it's happening. You're going to take a player like that. You hope to pay him for his second contract. That's what a team wants. So Ridley comes into the NFL pro ready. Like, I think he can run every single route. Whereas Washington, it seems like he might be able to. I don't know if they asked him to do it all at Oklahoma State, but I think that he's the type of receiver that honestly the Cowboys should be looking at in the late first round. I don't know if he lasts that long, but I would love to see him opposite Dez Bryant. I think that he's another threat. And I think that the Cowboys might be looking to move on from Dez Bryant. I don't know about the contract situation. That's a whole different story. But that's my ideal, I think, landing spot for James Washington. I would hate to see him go to Baltimore and waste his talent. But let's move on. We have so many receivers I want to cover here. But the next one is a player that I was kind of late to the party on because I didn't get to watch his tape. I was kind of going through the bigger name prospects, worked my way down. But Michael Gallup, Colorado State. I mean, he's a guy that, again, he played with a quarterback at Colorado State that didn't make him look as good as he should have, because there were times where I saw Michael Gallup get 5-10 yards of separation and the ball is just overthrown, and that's something that doesn't show up in the highlight reels that most people watch. When I watched him, I went back and watched again just because I was like, maybe I was gaga over this kid. Let me watch him again. He's got really good size. He's fluid in his movements. He's got solid initial burst. He does use his hands to wipe away press coverage pretty well. His footwork seems pretty solid. Again, he started at a community college due to bad SAT testing. So that's something that I don't know if NFL teams are going to take into consideration. I have no idea, but I love the kid's game. Is there anything you see with Gallup that could potentially move him up in the draft to maybe even the end of the first round?
I mean, it might, but the team would have to really fall in love with him and see something in a workout that I think really stands out. And I think that he's kind of that player. I mean, think about Robert Woods. Think about Robert Woods at USC. I thought he was the better receiver compared to Marquise Lee, but Marquise Lee was the better prospect because he had that game-breaking speed and the movement to make people miss and all that creativity. And when you see those types of plays, you think of difference makers. And oftentimes, decision makers fall in love with the idea of getting a difference maker, when what they sometimes need to see is who's a guy who can be a difference maker in the role that we need him to be.
Yes.
And when you look at Robert Woods was a terrific route runner with better speed than given credit for, but he played in a Buffalo Bills offense that really wasn't a great offense. The quarterbacks were in transition. The quarterbacks didn't really match the best skills that Woods had. The minute he went to to the Rams, that was a great choice. Just because, and I know that a lot of people in hindsight will say, well, how did we know Jared Goff would be good? That kind of thing. Well, I mean, I like Jared Goff, and he was my number one quarterback 2 years ago, and I didn't have any issues, even that, and I maintained that and doubled down on it, before last year,
Right.
about him. And Woods was a good match, in terms of what they do there. And so when you look at a guy like Gallup, one of the things that I really am impressed with him about that you may not hear a lot is his ability to read zones and be on the same page with his quarterback, where he's in the red zone, he understands what the coverage looks like, and he'll break off what the route may be designed to be, at the first stages of the post-snap process. And because he's, pre-snap, post-snap is one of the most important things you're looking at as a quarterback and receiver. And when they say being on the same page, it's not just about some little secret poker signal that they're making here, at the line of scrimmage about, okay, I'm going to throw to you. Sometimes it's being in the film room and practice, during the week, and saying, okay, if the safety's positioned here, the linebacker's positioned here, and the cornerback's playing you this way, then instead of running the slant, I want you to break it off and run straight downfield to the back of the end zone. Those types of situations that are talked about a lot in film study, a lot in position and group meetings, a lot on the practice field. And Gallup shows that with his quarterback, Nick Stevens. And Nick Stevens, while not a great deep thrower, and oftentimes he's taking punishment while trying to throw the ball that far downfield, Nick Stevens is renowned in college football for his ability to read pre-snap information. And there's some nice plays. I think there's one at Boise State that I show on my RSP film room or boiler room project on YouTube that shows Gallup making that type of read of that coverage triangle of the linebacker, safety, and cornerback, understanding, basically what they're going to be guarding on his side of the field, and being able to fix, basically change his route, and the quarterback picks up on that and finds him for an easy touchdown. And it's those plays that oftentimes get guys who seem average as athletes in terms of average for the NFL onto the field and productive on a regular basis. And that's where Gallup and Woods have something in common.
So here's my question to you. First off, do you think he's going to impress at the combine? Because he got a combine invite, which obviously should have happened. Can he raise his stock there? And two, what do you think his ceiling is as a player? Do you think it's possible that he ends up as a number one receiver, like with his ability to read a defense, to sit down in a zone, to be that kind of a possession style receiver?
I think it's unlikely that he's going to be that primary guy that you're going to count on in fantasy football as your top 12 to top 15 talent year after year after year. But I do think, and I don't think he'll probably impress at the combine at a high level. He'd probably have to run like a 4.3, high 4.3, low 4.4 in the 40 to truly like do that. And even then, the player that impressed the heck out of me back in the day, who was able to do that, and maybe I think might have been drafted in the first round, I don't remember, it might have been in the first 2 to 3 rounds, was USC's Steve Smith, not Utah Steve Smith, but USC Steve Smith, who bailed out Matt Leinart and made Matt Leinart look like look really good to a lot of people. But Steve Smith had, before he had the knee injuries, was coming on to be that primary guy who could be the primary possession guy who could also go deep for Eli Manning, but Gallup would have to do that. And I don't know. I don't think he has that kind of speed. I think he's good enough to get deep, but he's a guy that more than anything is your intermediate timing route player who, in the right offense could be that 80 to 90 catch guy as the absolute upside. But I would see him more as your probably your 60 to 70 catch receiver if he grows into a role and can be a nice contributor for fantasy football owners, but not a guy that's you're going to be drafting and counting on it to be a top 15 to top 20 receiver every year.
Very good. That's what I was looking for. That's awesome. Now, I think we're to the tier. Now, this is getting into a few of the smaller wide receivers in this draft class, though. And those, some may not be relegated to just slot work. I know we're going to talk through that, but some are physical. The ones that we're going to talk about, some are physical to win on the perimeter. Let's start with Texas A&M's Christian Kirk. I don't think he's going to beat anyone with his speed, but I think that he's seems to be a startable player who can become kind of what the Lions use, Golden Tate to do. Like I do project him as like one of those thicker slot receivers, not one of the slippery fast ones, but the sure-handed one that could run over the middle of the field. Where do you sit on Kirk right now as a prospect, and where do you project him on the field?
Yeah, I mean, Kirk was a very celebrated guy heading into the year, and when you look at the A&M receivers from the past couple of years, there were a lot of good players, who just didn't really capitalize at the level that you would like to see. When I look at Kirk, I mean, I think he runs his stems really well at a quick pace, and he can drop his weight into breaks, and he'll come back to the quarterback and do well on timing breaks that are across the field or back to the passer, and he can high point the ball. So you get a guy who can not only make plays in the timing game, but sometimes be a little bit of a rebounder. He can make those catches in tight coverage when that defender's kind of wrapped at his waist. And he is an effective runner. I mean, he can stiff arm, he can dip, jump cut, spin through contact, that kind of thing. And he'll lower his pads and finish, to get that extra yard or two. So I like that about his game. And as a blocker, he can get his hands into position and has some potential to develop there to help out in the run game. So he can be kind of a physical guy that can be used in 3 receiver sets, who can block a safety or a linebacker and get enough of a push, or at least shield the man enough that they can, develop an effective run game from, 11 personnel sets, which is a pretty versatile set and standard set that you often see in the NFL when they're running a spread type of look, they'll often do that. But I think that he still has to get better at his routes, which is something that a lot of guys here have to do. He's going to have to become a little bit more sudden, and that means just refining his hips, and being able to drop that weight a little bit more. But even though he's an effective runner, in the games I've watched thus far, and I still have more to watch of him. He's on the schedule for this week. I haven't seen him break a tackle.
Yes. So that's why I didn't want to say Golden Tate, because Golden Tate obviously breaks a lot of tackles, but he just is similar to the way they use him, just not a tackle breaker, which is obviously a concern when you're looking for that guy over the middle of the field.
Yeah, and so Golden Tate is a boss when it comes to breaking tackles. That's a running back in a wide receiver position, from that standpoint in the open field. And I think that he needs to be more consistent with his hand position as well when there's targets near his body. I've seen him, juggle multiple passes, and he didn't have the ball, he didn't have his hands away from his frame enough. And he's the type of player that you could see people getting really excited about for all the things that he did as a return specialist and being able to, make some plays in the open field. But then you're going to see him drop some passes in the NFL because he has to refine his hand position. And some of those tough plays that people go, oh, he should have caught that. Well, he could be that guy that for the first couple of years, you're like, he should have caught that. He's so close to becoming a good player. And half your friends are going, oh, he stinks. And, the other friends are like, no, he's really good. And then there, he drops a ball and they go, see, I told you. And the person wanting to make the argument that he's good can't really say anything other than give the weak, the technique just needs to get better, and everyone, and your friends just buy lynch mob basically. And I hate to use that term, but let's say mob mentality better, basically shout him down and say that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and then he goes to a different team and maybe learns a few things and works out well, or he just never figures it out and he just ends up being a highly talented contributor who can't get it all together.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the thing is, so it's safe to say, like, obviously you got to dig into more tape. And that's the thing is, even with me, I've gone through my first round of tape with these players. I'm going to go back and look at them more, especially the ones that are considered in the top 3 rounds, because those are the ones that I think we're projecting to start. I think that's where the teams look to start. They add depth as they go through the draft. But one of the players, Kirk, where do you grade him right now? Like, from just initial reaction, would you say that he should be on day 2, that he should be drafted, or do you feel like he's more someone that should be developed in day 3?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big time kind of, round type of guy. To me, I don't predict rounds, and I don't do the, hey, I'm Adam Schefter with a from my house type of thing. I'm more about just grading talent. If he goes to day 3, I wouldn't be surprised. If he's day 2, I wouldn't be surprised either. And wide receiver from, the guys I talk to who are in the league and who've scouted and do work with teams, what I'm told is that wide receiver is the highest variation of grades from team to team because of fit and because of how they perceive need or perceived skills. So Christian Kirk, to me, in my grading scale, which is different than the NFL's anyway, he's in the lower tier of players who within 2 to 3 years could become a regular productive contributor, which means he's got the talent to be one, but I see him more on that end of he's not a developmental project, but he's a, kind of a mid-round receiver who, if he goes to the late round, someone will say they got value.
All right, so let's throw a couple names in here, and we can hit on a few of these guys while we're right here. How about Dante Pettis and Anthony Miller? So we have Memphis's Anthony Miller, posted some incredible numbers at times, pass half the offense, like 2,900 yards, 32 touchdowns over the last 2 seasons. He didn't play the best competition. And then Dante Pettis, who, when we talk about team needs and things like that, I think that he is going to be someone who's a role player on a team. He's going to have to catch the ball in traffic an awful lot. I don't think he possesses good enough route running to basically get open at will, but I do think that he's really solid in a lot of things that he does. I think he's got solid hands. He catches the ball away from his body, decent speed. So I think he'll latch on, but comparing, would Kirk fit in with those guys like Anthony Miller and Dante Pettis?
I think he's a little bit on a lower tier, to be honest. But I have Anthony Miller and Dante Pettis probably a little higher than your tier. But to me, when you talk about Anthony Miller, I think I see a guy who understands how to find an open crease. So he's used to working in zones pretty well. I think he has very good boundary awareness. He's someone that can separate against off coverage and get inside of it. So he's a guy that, if you use him in the slot, I think that, and he can develop into a slot receiver, I think there's potential there for him to do so. And it's not because of his size, but of how he reads the field. And I think he can get good enough to be able to do that. He is a guy, though, that, he's not going to be an unbelievable productive runner, in terms of because of any type of power that he has. He's going to be a guy that has to beat them, with that first move in the open field. And dropping passes after contact, that's something that, he occasionally does. But I think that he's a fit-based type of player who could go higher than people think, because if he's in an offense like, I hate to bring up the Patriots, but I think of Julian Edelman and I think of Anthony Miller being a guy who's he's in that city. He's not in the neighborhood, but he's in the city. He might even be he's in the same area code. Let's just put it that way. And he can develop along those lines. And then Pettis reminds me, I like Pettis's route running to an extent. I think that he's very sudden. And you can see him accelerate up to top speed very quickly. He has a good first move in terms of that rocker step he's pretty good at. And I think, again, it's about leverage, flexibility, and acceleration. And in those departments, he has all of those. And he can really adjust to errant throws at a higher rate than a lot of the guys in this class can. Now, catching after contact, that's a bit of an issue. So when I think of Dante Pettis, I think of 2 of my absolute favorite pass catchers of the past 20 years, who are not talked about a lot. One got a lot of play this year, which was Marvin Jones, who I've always loved his game. And it's because he's flexible, he's tough after contact, he can make plays after the catch. He's very sudden in terms of early quickness and can tell a story with routes. But Pettis is not as good as Marvin Jones right now, and may never be as good as Marvin Jones right now. The other guy that he reminds me of, who I think is probably the greatest catch artist in the past 25 years, and I would put his tape up against anybody's in his best years in terms of just for the sheer act of winning balls in the vertical game in tight coverage and making acrobatic plays, and that's Brandon Lloyd. Brandon Lloyd, to me, if he didn't have, some emotional, mental health oriented issues, at least as, talked about by the Patriots media, I think that he would have been, I think if he played it the way he did as with Josh McDaniels, during the Bronco period and early with the Rams, you're looking at a guy who potentially could have been one of the better receivers in the league over a long period of time. He was just a fantastic player. And both those guys have great flexibility. They were sudden, even if they weren't blazing fast at the end of their routes. They could tell a story with their routes, and they had great hand-eye coordination. And I think the difference between, a guy like Pettis and Lloyd and Jones is the toughness at the catch point to concentrate and win those balls, and the ability to, consistently tell a story. I think he can learn to tell the story. I just don't know if he's going to be that good at the catch point. That's a hard thing to acquire. Either you're that way or you're not, or you're inconsistent at it. A good example of that is Brandon Cooks. People compared him to Steve Smith on a college, and I just used to laugh because it was just like, I like Brandon Cooks a lot, but Brandon Cooks does not win against tight man coverage very well. Go ask Xavier Howard, who shut him down this year, the Miami cornerback. And earlier, he's a good off coverage player, or a good vertical threat who has his back to the defender. But he's not going to play bigger than his size and win those passes. He's inconsistent at it at best. He'll make an occasional play that your buddy will go, "See, I told you," and then your buddies will shout him down and say, "Yeah, that was the first one in 8 times that he's had that opportunity in this game." And so that's the kind of player that I think Pettis is that he'll occasionally have some of those. So he's higher on my list, and he's a guy that I think could be a contributor, but he might even develop into a starter, but there's some things that he's got to work out. And part of that is just the route running angle. And if he does that, then he might be the guy that you look at and go, he's like a more dynamic Terrence Williams. He does some really good things for us, but everybody kind of forgets about him. And in your fantasy draft, you're like, do I draft him? Do I even really care to? He's going to do well, but when am I going to put him in my lineup?
Right. No, I'm going to go back and watch some more Dante Pettis because you got me thinking about the whole Brandon Lloyd thing. And Brandon Lloyd, obviously, he led the league in receiving one year. And I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, that was with Kyle Orton as his quarterback there. So he definitely had a big year that I remembered. The career quarterbacks that he had, he was with the Bears for, I think, a year or two in there. He didn't have the greatest quarterbacks throughout his career.
If there was a player who inspired the Matrix, it was Brandon Lloyd.
Love it. I didn't plan to talk about this player yet, but I'm so curious to hear your take on him because it's a player that I'm higher on than I think. I don't know. I don't think everybody, but because there's a lot of opinions out there right now. But Texas Tech's Keke Coutee, I don't even want to gush about him yet. I want to hear your take on him because I get excited watching him play football. He's just the kid's got speed on demand. There's some circumstances, but have you watched tape on him yet? Do you have an initial impression?
Oh yeah, I have. I like the fact that he's quick twitch. He definitely catches the ball in tight zones in the middle of the field, and he can take contact to his back to do so, kind of like Calvin Ridley can. I think he shields the defender pretty well in tight coverage. And he's someone that's just he's not fazed by tight coverage play. And that's something that you need to be a playmaker in the NFL. And he's got that great quick start movement and burst. He's going to get on top of defenders early. He can create after the catch extremely well. And he's someone that works through some physical play. So he works through trash. And the best way that I would put that is you can stiff arm through reaches. I characterize contact as reaches, wraps, and hits. And if you can, most running backs and wide receivers can run through reaches. The ones who can't, that's notable, and you need to say, you need to talk about that more often than not. Wraps, that's a decent amount of power. If you can run through a wrap, you've got probably high-end contributor to low-end starter power or regular starter power. And if you can bounce off hits with any combination of a wrap or reach to that, and you do that, and you can do that multiple times in a play, you're a freaking all-star, in terms of your power and balance. And Coutee is someone that can run through reaches. And I think that, he could lower his pads a little bit more, so he's not going to be an extremely powerful guy. And I still think, when you talk about ball carriage, he can be a little wild. So there's some things he does because he's so dynamic and he can get rerouted a little too easily right now. but he does, he's a guy that I think, understands, really how to catch and run. And because of his creativity and because of the quarterback difference that he's had this past year and the year before, you really want to watch him with Patrick Mahomes. But the problem with that is that Patrick Mahomes was my top quarterback in last year's class, and he's a magician and the exception to the rule. So are you going to really get a quarterback who's going to throw to QT the way Patrick Mahomes does? And I think the answer is probably not. But with the right matchup, I think QT could be a much better player than people are talking about him to be. At worst, he's like Taylor Gabriel. You look at Taylor Gabriel and he's able to make some big plays, and you could get excited about him in an offense as that slot or occasional outside guy. But at best, he could be that guy that you go, is he that guy that transitions the way Antonio Brown transitioned into the NFL? That's
could it be a Brandon Cooks? Could it be a Brandon Cooks type thing where it's like he's 5'11", he's 180, so he's a small guy. I feel like in the right offense, he could be ridiculous. And that's the thing. You mentioned Mahomes. I went back and watched 2016 as well as 2017. He actually posted bigger numbers in 2017 without Mahomes. And that's the thing is you could see the same player. He adjusts to the deep ball extremely well.
Yep.
It's just, is he one of the players that where it's really going to come down to landing spot?
I think it will come down to landing spot with him. And, he's one of those guys that will impress. I think he will impress or at least flash somewhere. And the problem with that is he's going to have to be your patience play prospect. And I am probably one of the big time, benefactors of touting patience plays at, in the draft and with rookies. And, I've been known probably, I'm starting a newsletter this year for the RSP, and I already can anticipate that my newsletter subscribers, will probably, be seeing about 50, probably 30% of the content will be me talking about be patient with this player, because that's what I always preach, because there are often guys who they get drafted late, and being drafted late means that you're not going to get a lot of opportunities early on in practice. You don't get as many reps, and teams regard you with bias. My buddy Ryan Riddle, who I talk about a lot, who is a former defensive end for Cal, he's their sack leader, their season sack leader, record holder, played with Aaron Rodgers and Marshawn Lynch, and played a little bit in the NFL with a few teams. Ryan talked about the hidden advantage of being a high NFL draft pick. And that's something where basically think about it. If you're going to invest your highest amount of money in your first round guys, not only are you looking for you have a bias inherent based on wanting to give them as many opportunities as possible to show that they can do what you've paid them to do. And in contrast, guys in the later rounds, they may get 1 to 2 reps a day compared to the same guy who gets 5 to 7. And that's a big difference, because you don't have an opportunity. If you don't impress, they're like, see, he's a late round pick, he didn't do very well. And then if the early round pick makes the same mistakes 2 or 3 times, they're like, well, he'll get it, he'll catch on, he'll figure it out. And that attitude is prevalent with NFL teams. It's why a guy like Isaiah Crowell, who I talked about years ago as a running back, saying he's not going to be drafted because of what happened off the field, but he's arguably the best running back talent in this class that year. And if it weren't for the fact that Dion Lewis got injured in the 3rd preseason game against the Bears and broke his leg in the late 3rd quarter, and they needed somebody to come in and play a guy that they had as an undrafted free agent, and he ripped off some good runs, and they said, oh, he's actually pretty good. And he ends up being their starter for a few years, and is a pretty good NFL running back. People will argue about that, but that's the type of thing that happens. And Dion Lewis, think about him, the number of teams he's been on before he became Dion Lewis. And that's the type of thing that could happen to Keke Coutee.
That's the best way to put it. And that's what I like. And that's why I always want to put a big note across the podcast. Obviously it's not possible, but just saying that landing spot really does matter in the NFL. And I think that some people tend to overlook that. And just because a prospect didn't turn into what you thought he might be, it doesn't mean that the skill wasn't there. It doesn't mean that your evaluation was wrong. It just may have been the wrong fit, and he may have never gotten the opportunity. All right, so we're running up against the clock here, but this is a player here that I'm pretty sure that everybody, their ears are going to perk up when I say his name, because with the way that the rate he's going right now, I'm pretty sure that Draft Twitter is trying to put him as a first round pick by the end of April, and that's Maryland's DJ Moore. He's 5'11". He's built very well. He weighs 215 pounds, so I don't think that he's someone that should be pigeonholed into the slot. He's got excellent body control. He seems to have good hands. I see some inconsistencies in his route running. I see inconsistency in his play, but where are you at on DJ Moore? And is this hype kind of getting out of control? Because some people are moving him into their top 3 receivers in this class.
Yeah, I'm not convinced he's a top 3 receiver in this class by any stretch of the imagination. I've compared the player I've actually compared him to is a guy who's come up a couple times in this conversation today, which is Golden Tate. But Golden Tate is a much better player. I think that DJ Moore can be physical. I think that he is fairly quick. And I think he can make some plays, but he has to refine his ability in terms of fade routes and how to get into position. He doesn't make plays that he should because of that. He does not understand the nuances of gaining separation. He just thinks, oh, I'm fast enough, quick enough. I can just go outside of you, go inside of you. And then he faces defenders who are good college players, and he doesn't get that separation. So I'm looking at a player who has the talent to become a strong player in the NFL, but he's more of a projection at this point.
That's how I feel. And like, that's the thing, is just like when all of a sudden this started coming up, I'm like, I think DJ Moore is a solid player from what I've seen so far, but I'm not seeing a second round talent. No. Some people are saying, pass on Calvin Ridley and grab DJ Moore in the second. It'll be just as productive. I don't believe that at all. I do. Like I said, I believe that he can be a solid NFL player. I kind of put him in the territory with Pettis. Honestly, that's where, when I initially watched them, again, we're very early in this process. Like this, the idea of going through this and going through all these receivers is to give you guys an idea as to the players that they could become, the players that you should expect, when they're drafted. And DJ Moore, I don't see a game changer. I don't see someone that is going to walk onto a team and going to be an immediate impact, which is something that you want out of, a late first round, early second round pick. Unless, there's someone that's extremely young, like, I don't want to say Kevin White, but he's someone that was extremely raw and you knew it was going to take time, but you knew that the upside was, there was a risk return there. Where DJ Moore, he's a very well-rounded receiver. I'm not saying that he's not, but I just don't know if I see what everybody else does at this point.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'll go a step further and say I'm not sure he's a well-rounded receiver yet, based on the nuances and the way that I look at the game. I just don't think he gets off press coverage well. I don't think he runs good routes. I don't think that he understands how to get position on fade routes. And that's supposed to be his game. Some of these things that his game's built on. Does it mean that he's not going to learn them? No, these are all teachable things. So it's something that he can acquire and develop. And people say, well, he'll be coached up. That's the problem. Is that coached up in the NFL is being coached to scheme. It's not being coached to technique.
Yes.
And it's being coached to technique is the player going, hey, say, hey, Golden Tate, thanks, or a good example of being coached up in the NFL is Michael Thomas at Ohio State. When he got drafted, I talked about how, during the draft, Cardale Jones basically went on, was quoted as saying, Drew Brees better be prepared for Mike Thomas to be basically attached to his hip from the moment they first meet. And he will probably initiate that because that's what he did with me when I became the starter at Ohio State. And sure enough, when he got drafted, the first thing he did after he got off the phone was tweet that basically, I'm going to be calling you, Drew Brees. Let's get together, and it was like, you see the result there. And, it's not like Michael Thomas was, a Calvin Ridley, Courtland Sutton type of athlete. And I don't even know, he might be a Courtland Sutton type athlete. We'll see how he runs. But, he wasn't an AJ Green, Julio Jones type of player. Right. He's producing at a level now because of fit. So, and also work ethic and refining skills. DJ Moore will have to prove that he wants it bad enough, and I'm not saying that he doesn't, but it's one of those things that we don't know. Is he going to work hard enough? Does he know how to work smart? Does he know who to contact? Is he going to be in a situation where all that works out well? Because the team's going to be spending more time on, do you know your role? Do you know the play calls? Do you understand what routes you're supposed to run? And we just expect you to get open. However you do that, you just need to be open and on time and catch the ball and make a play. We may go over some drills early on, in every practice that spend 5 minutes doing this. But if you're a musician, if you've ever been a musician, I relate a lot of things to music, and I want you to think of practice like this. When you rehearse with a band, you're not practicing tone, you're not practicing rhythm, you're not practicing technique, you're not practicing theory, you're practicing the songs that you're going to perform. You may warm up as a group. Maybe if you're in like a high school band, they have you play some scales to warm up your fingers, or maybe hold some long tones to make sure that you're all playing in tune. But if you're really going to work on playing in tune, if you're going to really work on your rhythm and do all those things, you're going to sit in a room by yourself and you're going to practice for several hours every day until you get great at it. And NFL doesn't have time for that. They give you all the time in the world afterwards to do all that kind of thing. They're going to give you 5 minutes to warm up and get facility with some of these things. And they're going to be working on the scheme. So when they say, yeah, they're going to coach them up. Yeah, good luck with that. That's not exactly how that works.
Now that we made the entire draft Twitter angry with us, before we get out of here, I need to throw out a couple more big players that I know people are going to be attached to because they're big receivers and people love the big receivers. But just let's hit on these guys really quick. Let's start with Oklahoma State's Marcel Aitman. We have Notre Dame's Equinemius St. Brown, who is 6'5", but weighs just 203 pounds. And then lastly, the one I wanted to bring up, he might be the biggest wide receiver in the top 15 prospects, and that's Florida State's Auden Tate, who is at 6'5", 225. Is there any of these players that you feel like there's the potential there for them to be, that guy like a Courtland Sutton?
Yeah, I actually like Auden Tate better than Courtland Sutton. So I think Auden Tate is probably the guy that we should be talking about as opposed to Courtland Sutton. He is a fantastic ball catcher. He might have the best hands of the receivers in this class in terms of making contested plays and going up for the ball and making athletic plays. And he can get separation. He's got that quickness, that short area quickness to be a good player. So I think that he's the guy we should be talking about over Courtland Sutton. So I'm impressed with him. Equinemius St. Brown, I'm impressed that he speaks 3 languages. I'm impressed that he's quick and he's fluid and that he can make some plays for you, but he doesn't make the plays that people are trying to compare him to AJ Green. He doesn't make those tough guy, primary option type of plays that you're looking for from a player. And his blocking needs a lot of work. Some of his separation skills need a lot of work. So I think he's still a guy that needs 2 to 3 years of development, and you're going to see flashes of things that people go, well, look at his previous year's tape, not last year's tape. Well, that's true when you're talking about Lamar Jackson. You want to look at this year's tape as opposed to last year's tape, as a quarterback. But the whole look at certain year of tape for St. Brown I've seen both years. Let me tell you, he's an okay prospect. He's not special on this level yet. We'll have to develop in order to be special. Aitman's physical. He can drop his weight and get in and out of breaks on some perimeter routes, so that's really nice, and comes back to the ball, and he can break a tackle, and he can win the ball in the air. I think he's a good receiver who can give you kind of what Phillip Rivers often had from receivers who were like Malcolm Floyd type of player, Yeah. And then the guy that we didn't talk about, but I want to mention real quick because I like him as much as I like Tate, is UCLA's Jordan Lasley. Jordan Lasley's kind of a fast riser because he's been in and out of trouble, and I like troublemakers. So one of the problems that I tend to have is that I find players that I really like who have some sort of off-field issues, and I discover that later on after I've already seen their tape. I think I'm a radar for that. So Jordan Lasley I really like, but he's someone that he has very good hand usage at the line of scrimmage. If Calvin Ridley's hand usage was as good as Lasley's hands in that off the line of scrimmage, if Lasley and Ridley could be combined into one player, you would have the primary receiver that people would be falling all over themselves to get. That's basically Lasley's quick. He's fast. He can get deep. He can win in tight coverage deep. He's got a little bit of what Ridley doesn't have in that sphere of being able to play physically against defenders down the field on certain types of targets that Ridley sometimes struggles with. And while he's not quite as quick as Ridley, he's good off the line and can get better because I think footwork's easier to learn than hand usage. A lot of guys use their hands in a variety of ways, but they're not effective at it. Like Simi Cobbs has a rip move. It never works. Simi Cobbs has a chop move. It does work. But, so there are guys that, when you hear people say, oh, they use this technique and they use that technique. Well, they use it effectively? And Lasley uses his hands effectively. He's just got to learn how to combine that with his footwork. And I think that he'll be getting more and more separation. And he's a guy that I look forward to seeing 2 to 3 years down the line being a good starting wide receiver, as long as his temper and his behavior stay, he matures. And I like to give people the room to mature because, I know what I was like in my late teens, early 20s. And I think that, we'd like to give people the same opportunity.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong because I've been starting to catch up with that off the field stuff. Was Lasley's? I thought it was a couple alcohol charges. Was it a fake ID and something with alcohol?
Yeah.
I could be wrong on that one.
I think it was, and he's a little bit of a hothead on the field who talks a lot of trash, and he can get into shoving matches and kind of get distracted on a level where you wonder about that behavior in terms of him playing himself out of a lineup, for those types of situations. I doubt it'll happen, but those are things that you just kind of note and say, okay, well, worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, Juju, I remember Juju in college had that a little bit where people would get under his skin and he showed his emotion on the field, but obviously he turned out okay. But lastly, I'm happy you brought him up. He's someone that, he only had one year of great production. It obviously helps that, his quarterback is being projected as a, top 3 pick. That helps. But I do, my notes on him was that he was used all over the field. They put him in motion. They used him on screens. He can do it all. He runs solid routes, gets up to speed relatively quick. Natural athlete who is not easy to tackle, and he's got solid hands. So I definitely believe that if he's the type of player, if he lands in the right place, he can make an impact in the NFL. Tate, the one note that you kind of echoed a lot of the stuff that I have down on him, but the one thing that I've noticed about his game, the more I watched him, is that he does these subtle movements as the ball's coming to him. He does not allow the defender to know that he's about to make a catch. And that's like a very underrated skill to have as a college prospect. That's something that can be taught up in the NFL. We were just talking about that, like be coached up. Like don't give away to the cornerback that you're about to catch this ball. You have to make these subtle movements. And Auden Tate really does that. You're the first person that I've heard say that you actually like him more than Courtland Sutton, which makes me feel better about my kind of evaluation in this entire process. Because Sutton was someone that I really have a lot of question marks about, and Tate was someone I wanted to like more, but it's just like you get stuck in this mindset that you're like, wow, why doesn't anybody like Tate? Why aren't they moving him up draft boards? Because he's obviously got the size. He's got the athleticism. His body control is great for a guy that's 6'5", 225 pounds. So I'm so glad. And that's, that's
he makes more big boy catches than any player that I've seen thus far. I mean, if my grade holds up for him, he will be the only, and I have, I watched one final round left before I put the book out in April of players. And I just finished watching him again like last week. And he's the only player who is graded at the highest tier for catching the football, of the guys in this class. And I mean, because in every situation I've seen thus far, and in the variety of situations I grade for, he's done it. Now I'm waiting to see if that's a level of consistency. And I gave him that highest grade right now because I kind of want to see it sticks out in my mind to help me go. I got to go back and watch to see if he's consistent on some of these areas where he graded out this highly. And if he's not consistent, then, he'll probably drop down and still be at the same level as guys like Washington and Ridley, which is still not bad.
Right. No, definitely not. We were talking before we went on air and saying we want a wide receiver class like we had back when AJ Green and Julio Jones were coming out. It's like we feel like we haven't had one of those classes in a while. And I don't think that this is one of them. I feel like there's a lot of guys that can contribute in this class, but overall as a wide receiver, class, I don't think that this is one of the best ones we've ever had. Maybe the depth, as teams start to expand into 3 wide receiver and 4 wide receiver sets, you're going to start to see more and more wide receivers drafted because teams need to be deeper than ever at the position. So that's why we wanted to try and touch on all these names. And Matt, I really appreciate you hopping on. As I mentioned, I always learn something when I talk, when you talk, and I always want to pay attention. And we really appreciate you coming on today.
Hey, Michael, it was great meeting you, and it was fun chopping it up with you. It was fun to hear your takes on some of these players, and I liked hearing what you had to say about them, and they were, they were very well-informed takes, and I'm looking forward to, chatting with you more down the line.
Absolutely, guys. This is going to wrap up the NFL Draft wide receiver episode. So much goodness out of Matt Waldman again on this episode. I'm pretty sure that we could have extended this to 4 hours if we were able to. But don't worry, we're going to be talking some of these players a lot more in depth as the draft approaches. This episode was meant to give you an idea as to what to expect from some of the top prospects and what tiers they should fall into. Make sure to follow Matt on Twitter at Matt Waldman and myself at Mike Tagliere NFL for updates on all of our work. We'll be back next week to discuss this year's quarterback and tight end class with Dynasty League Football's Bradley Ilatello. I probably screwed that up, but we're going to talk to him next week. But until next time, guys, lights out.
I just wanted you to watch me dissolve.